Welcome back to the Brittany Hughes Show. Hope you guys have had a wonderful week so far. Thank you so much for being here with me today. This week, of course, marked one of the most solemn occasions in this country, the anniversary of the September 11th terrorist attacks. I, for one, cannot believe that it has been 22 years. It feels like yesterday in my mind. I know many of you feel the same way and get angry all over again when we see those pictures, when we see that footage, when we hear the recordings of the people who went through the horror that day. I don't think that's ever going to get old or stop affecting those of us, especially who remember it, those who lived through it, those who lost loved ones. So this past week was as difficult as it always is. Of course, President Joe Biden commemorated the occasion. He was the first president to mark the anniversary of the 9/11 terrorist attacks from someplace other than one of the attacked sites or the White House lawn, breaking from tradition. He addressed troops in Anchorage, Alaska this week. To be quite honest with you, I didn't have so much of a problem with that per se as some other people did. I felt that addressing the troops was at least on point there. I think that at least celebrating or commemorating the anniversary of 9/11 with American troops at least was something. I also think that at some point it does make sense that presidents are going to start commemorating this occasion elsewhere, not necessarily on the sites. 22 years seems a little bit quick to me. Maybe that's because I remember it again like it was yesterday. That didn't necessarily upset me, though, as much as the fact that Biden did what Biden typically does, and he stood in front of the troops and he stood in front of the American people and he told another lie. Biden falsely claimed that he was at Ground Zero the day after the terrorist attack, so on September 12th, 2001, and that he stood there and he looked at the gaping abyss and it was like looking into the mouth of hell. Here's what he had to say.
I join you on this solemn day to renew our sacred vow. Never forget. Never forget. We never forget. Each of us, each of those precious lives stolen too soon when evil attacked. Ground Zero in New York, and I remember standing there the next day and looking at the building. I felt like I was looking through the gates of hell. It looked so devastating because from where you could stand.
So this, of course, is not true. Biden was not at Ground Zero the day after the September 11th terrorist attacks. He was at the U.S. Senate actually addressing the U.S. Senate, condemning the terror attacks, as were many other senators. He was in Washington, D.C. He was not at Ground Zero. It took him 9 days to get to Ground Zero, which is not necessarily something that is worthy of criticism. It was an absolute mess, as anybody who remembers that time can attest to. They were still pulling people out of the rubble. It was absolutely horrific. The fact that he was not at Ground Zero until 9 days later is not necessarily a problem. But when you stand there and you claim, look, I was there the day after, and naturally, this was a mistake, if you want to be gracious about it, that was caught by the media. And here's how the media kind of spins it, right? This is a gaffe. This is another incident of Joe Biden not remembering dates. He can't remember when he did what, and he's old. Here's how Forbes reported it. Biden falsely says he was in New York City on September 12th, 2001, adding to incidents raising concerns about his age. So this whole thing is being framed as a gaffe. He can't remember when he was where. He's getting dates mixed up, and this is adding more concern about the fact that he's 80 years old and he's clearly starting to lose it a little bit, and that's not necessarily untrue. There are many concerns about Biden's age. The day before, on September 10th, this was one of the most awkward incidents I think I have ever seen involving a sitting U.S. president. Biden literally had his mic cut off by White House staff in the middle of a sentence, which I've never seen happen to another president. Correct me if I'm wrong. Rarely, if ever. He was rambling on about third world countries and climate change, and clearly was starting to stumble all over himself and couldn't quite get his thoughts together. And the White House press secretary actually had to come in and cut off his mic and tell reporters that the presser was over. Here's that clip.
We talked about at the conference overall. We talked about stability. We talked about making sure that the third world, the southern hemisphere had access to change it, had access. It wasn't confrontational at all.
Thank you, everybody. This is my press conference. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
So not only was he cut off, but he continued trying to answer reporters' questions, and they gradually turned up the jazz music behind him to sort of like force him off stage. Because staffers have gotten so concerned about Joe Biden being able to stand up there off the cuff, off a teleprompter, off script, and be able to think on the fly and answer questions. It's very clear that he's no longer able to do that, at least in the way that he used to be. And this is not the first, of course, mistake he's made. Back in August, he wrongly claimed that he had already declared a climate change a national emergency. That wasn't true. And so, again, all of this kind of gets added to the list of gaffes that we're supposed to blame on his age. Here's the problem with that, though. As much as that may be true, as much as it may be true that Biden's age is starting to show both in his physical stamina and also in his mental acuity, that's not untrue. When it comes to Biden peddling false stories about his past, however, that did not start when he started rounding the corner to 80. This is a man who has been lying habitually for years. This goes back decades. This is not something new. This is not something that cropped up all of a sudden as Biden got older. This is not a person with a well-founded history of telling the truth who is clearly starting to lose his grasp on his memory just in the last few years. And there is no shortage of examples of outright Biden lies dating back decades, all the way back in the 1980s. Joe Biden was caught openly plagiarizing multiple speeches by a British Labour Party leader, Neil Kinnock, another from Robert F. Kennedy, another from John F. Kennedy, another from Senator Hubert Humphrey. Biden was regularly plagiarizing speeches, which is effectively lying about your own words. You're ripping them without credit from somebody else. During that same exact time, he regularly and repeatedly lied about earning academic awards that he didn't actually earn, about going to law school on a full scholarship, which he didn't. He stated that he graduated in the top half of his class when he actually finished 76th out of 85 students. One time while he was speaking to technical college students just in November of 2021, Biden actually claimed, "I used to drive a tractor trailer, though only for part of a summer."
I used to drive a tractor trailer.
Oh, awesome.
And so I know a little bit about driving big trucks.
No, that's great.
But anyway, I only did it for part of a summer.
Oh, okay.
But I got my license to do it.
He said something similar at a Mack Trucks facility back in July when he claimed, "I used to drive an 18-wheeler, man."
And anyway,
And if we
I
don't
used to
do,
drive an 18-wheeler, man.
Yeah.
oh, I wish
Oh,
I
yeah?
could.
That's
I
awesome.
got to.
Of course, there's no evidence that Biden ever actually drove a truck. He may have sat in one every now, whatever, take his picture in a big rig with his thumbs up. I don't know. But this is somebody, I mean, this is not a blue collar guy. This is a career politician. He was never a truck driver. That's ridiculous. There's no evidence that he ever even drove a truck, much less was actually an employed truck driver. He has repeatedly told a story about a supposed conversation during his vice presidency that he had with an Amtrak train conductor who he says praised him for traveling more miles on the train than he did on Air Force Two while he was vice president.
I commuted every single day, 263 miles a day on Amtrak from the time I got elected United States Senator. As a matter of fact, when I was vice president, I used to like to take the train home because my mom was very sick and dying, and I'd come home every weekend to make sure I'd take the train home. And the Secret Service, and I'm not criticizing, legitimately would rather me fly because it's safer, because too many people can get on and off, etc. I'm getting on one Friday, and then one of the senior guys on Amtrak, Angelo Negri, I got to know all the conductors really well. They became my friends. I mean, really, my genuine friends. I'd have them at my home at Christmas and during the summer. And Ange walks up to me and goes, "Joey, baby!" grabs my cheek, and I thought the Secret Service was going to blow his head off. I said, I swear to God, true story. I said, no, he's a friend. I said, "What's up, Ange?" He said, "Joey, I read in the paper, you travel 1,200,000 miles on Air Force planes, because they keep meticulous tabs of it. I said, yeah. He said, big, I won't say the whole thing, big deal. So you know how many miles you travel on Amtrak, Joey? And I said, no. He said, the boys and I figured out the retirement dinner. He said, you traveled 2 million, I think it was 180, but 2,200,000 miles. I said, how'd you get that, Ann? He said, well, 267 miles a day. We figured you traveled 119 days a year for 36 years, and then you traveled as vice president. He goes, so Joey, I don't want to hear this about the Air Force anymore. I'm a train guy.
Here's the problem. That conversation could not possibly have happened because the man he's referencing had retired 2 decades before, and he was dead by the time this conversation supposedly took place. Again, what we see is a history years ago, starting years ago, of lying about his own past, about his own record, largely with anecdotes about his life that he thinks is going to make him more relatable to the people to whom he is speaking. He has repeatedly boasted that he traveled 17,000 miles with Chinese President Xi Jinping.
And by the way, I have met person to person with Xi Jinping more than any other world leader. 68 hours alone, he and I, with an interpreter, back when I was vice president all the way through, because as you remember, it was clear he was going to be president, and it wasn't appropriate for the president of the United States, Barack Obama, to be traveling the world with him, but I traveled 17,000 miles with him when he was vice president in China.
Although that number is not even close to correct. In fact, no one, including his own staff, has been able to figure out where in the world he came up with that number. Makes no sense whatsoever. If you care about truth and transparency, you should also care where your health coverage dollars are going. Every single year, millions of Americans just like you pay exorbitant premiums for healthcare coverage that you might not use or even need, only for your hard-earned dollars to go to pay for medical procedures you may not agree with, like abortions or gender-affirming surgeries. If that sounds like you, and if you want to sleep easy, knowing that you're getting the coverage that you need without paying too much and without paying for other people's medical procedures that violate your beliefs, you need Share Healthcare. I'm partnering with Share Healthcare to let people know about their affordable, cost-effective alternative to traditional health insurance. Share Healthcare is not traditional health insurance. It's a cost-sharing plan between people of like faith and values who simply want to pay for the coverage they need without violating their conscience. If that sounds like you, check out sharehealthcare.com, enter the referral code MRCTV23, sharehealthcare.com, MRCTV23, and find a plan that's right for you and your family today. And the list goes on and on and on. Biden, in one of the worst examples of his repeated decades of lies, he has repeatedly lied about his own personal tragedies in an effort to use them for political gain. In one of the worst examples, Biden repeatedly claimed that the driver of the tractor trailer involved in the car accident that killed his first wife and his 1-year-old daughter, it was a horrible tragedy, claimed that that man was drunk at the time of the wreck, when in fact there is no evidence whatsoever to suggest that. A week after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, Biden stood in front of an audience and claimed that his wife's station wagon had been hit by a drunk driver. In December of 2007, he claimed that, quote, a tractor trailer, a guy who allegedly, and I never pursued it, drank his lunch instead of eating his lunch, broadsided my family and killed my wife instantly, and killed my daughter instantly, and hospitalized my 2 sons with what were thought at the time to be permanent fundamental injuries. Which is interesting to me, because if you believe, and if there is evidence to show that the guy who broadsided your wife and killed her and your 1-year-old daughter was drunk as a skunk at the time, why wouldn't you pursue that? He said allegedly, and I never pursued it. If he was drunk and there's evidence to show that, why wouldn't you pursue that? Why wouldn't you want justice for your dead wife and your dead 1-year-old child? That makes absolutely no sense, and here's why. There's no evidence that the guy who was involved in this accident was drunk or was speeding or was even at fault at all. According to Politico back in 2009, Curtis Dunn of Pennsylvania was not charged with drunk driving or anything else that would indicate fault on his part at the time of the accident. In fact, evidence suggested that Nelia Biden had actually been the one who failed to yield the truck's right-of-way, and that Dunn could not have stopped in time to keep from hitting her, though tire marks showed that he did slam on his brakes at his own risk. It was a horrible tragedy that ended in the deaths of 2 people, including an infant, and yet Biden has twisted this story at least twice in order to use it as a tool in a political stump speech, in order to gin up emotional reaction, in order to score political points. Didn't matter that it wasn't true. Didn't matter that this is a man who had never been charged with drunk driving. There was no evidence to suggest that he was actually the one at fault in this accident. Didn't matter that he was a man who did not have the platform, did not have the microphone of Joe Biden, whose name and reputation and family got dragged through the mud, all so that Joe Biden could stand up in front of an audience and score emotional points for political gain. And he did this repeatedly. And this is not the last time that he used personal tragedy and embellished or outright lied about it in order to score points. He's repeatedly, of course, claimed that his son, Beau Biden, died in Iraq.
Just imagine, I mean it sincerely. I say this as a father of a man who won the Broad Star, the Conspicuous Service Medal, and lost his life in Iraq.
Of course, we know that that's not true. Beau Biden served in Iraq from 2008 to 2009, but he passed away in 2015 from glioblastoma at Walter Reed Medical Military Hospital in Bethesda, Maryland. But still, Biden has repeated that lie several times, including at least twice this year and once last year during a speech in Colorado. Speaking of Colorado, during a speech there back in January of 2022, following some wildfires that had ripped through the state, Biden claimed that he had almost lost his wife and his entire home in a house fire back in 2007. He told this same story back in 2021 when he claimed that he once, quote, had a house burned down with my wife in it. She got out safely, God willing. And then he repeated this story again in front of displaced Hawaiians just this past summer.
I don't want to compare difficulties, but we have a little sense, Jill and I, what it's like to lose a home. Years ago, now 15 years ago, I was in Washington doing Meet the Press. It was a sunny Sunday, and lightning struck at home on a little lake that's outside of our home, not a lake, a big pond, and hit a wire and came up underneath our home into the heating ducts, the air conditioning duct. To make a long story short, I almost lost my wife, my 67 Corvette, and my cat.
And in each instance, he's claimed that the house fire almost killed his wife. God forbid, it almost destroyed his Corvette, which I'm sure really made all of these displaced Hawaiians who lost everything in the fires in Maui, made them feel so much better. Here's this president telling them about how he almost once lost a sports car. So sorry about your home and your loved ones and your entire community. The lie detector test proved that this whole entire exaggerated, embellished story was basically a lie. According to reports at the time, this fire back in 2007 at the Biden home was a minor kitchen fire. It was caused by a lightning strike. Nobody was injured. According to firefighters, the fire was minor and was contained within about 20 minutes, and it was relegated to the kitchen of the home. When Biden says that he had his house burned down around his wife and she almost died and they almost lost everything and most of the stuff in the house was utterly destroyed, that is a lie. That's not just saying that the fish was this big when it was really this big. That is an outright lie. He did not have a home burned to the ground. His wife was not almost killed. He didn't almost lose everything. The things that he owned were not completely destroyed. That is a lie. But when you're standing in front of wildfire victims in Colorado or in Hawaii and you're trying to make yourself sound relatable, we've been through the same thing. I understand you. Saying you had a minor kitchen fire that blew some smoke in a couple of rooms and didn't actually hurt anybody is not really going to jive with the people who are sitting there who've lost everything. But Biden repeatedly tries to make himself sound relatable and to score points with any given audience that he might be in front of, even if it means saying whatever he has to, however false, in order to make himself look good. He likes to fancy himself a crusader for civil rights. He just doesn't have the creds to back it up, so he has to invent them. He has a storied history of lies about his civil rights activism. Back in 2020, Biden repeatedly claimed that he was arrested trying to see Nelson Mandela in South Africa back in the 70s, except that never happened. Here's him claiming that he was actually arrested in the streets trying to get to Nelson Mandela.
This day, 30 years ago, Nelson Mandela walked out of prison and entered into discussions about apartheid. I had the great honor of meeting him. I had the great honor of being arrested with our UN ambassador on the streets of Soweto trying to get to see him on Robbins Island.
Now, campaign staffers tried to clean up Biden's story. They told reporters that he was referring to a time when he was separated from some of his black colleagues at an airport while he was on a trip. But see, that's not at all what Biden said. That's not what he said. What he said was, I was arrested in the streets trying to get to Nelson Mandela. He never said in an airport. He said he wasn't temporarily separated from black colleagues. I was arrested in South Africa trying to meet with Nelson Mandela. He also added on several occasions that Nelson Mandela personally thanked him for trying to see him, even at the expense of getting arrested in the process. Except that never happened. That never happened. And campaign staffers' attempts to clean that up and make it sound like, well, this is what he was actually referring to, makes no sense, because what they were saying he was referring to didn't at all sound like the story that he had been peddling. And his own campaign ended up having to admit it. The Washington Post, in fact, said that the claim was so ridiculous they gave it 4 Pinocchios. And that's not his only lie about civil rights activism. He has repeatedly over the years claimed that he participated in the civil rights movement in the 1960s, but then he's also walked that back. When he first ran for president back in '87, he claimed he'd marched in the streets and participated in sit-ins.
When I marched in the civil rights movement, I did not march with a 12-point program. I marched with tens of thousands of others to change attitudes. And we changed attitudes.
When I was 17 years old, like many of you, I participated in sit-ins to desegregate the restaurants and movie houses of Wilmington, Delaware.
I came out of the civil rights movement. I was one of those guys that sat in and marched and all that stuff.
And then he walked back those claims a few months later, saying that he never marched in the streets and was, quote, not an activist.
During the 60s, I was, in fact, very concerned about the civil rights movement. I was not an activist. I worked at an all-black swimming pool in the east side of Wilmington, Delaware. I was involved in what they were thinking, what they were feeling. I was involved, but I was not out marching. I was not down in Selma. I was not anywhere else. I was a suburbanite kid who got a dose of exposure to what was happening to black Americans when I'm in my own city.
And then later, while serving as Obama's vice president and campaigning against Trump in later years, Biden once again began claiming that he had helped desegregate his local movie theaters and had marched with civil rights leaders.
You know, when I was a teenager in Delaware, for real, I got involved in the civil rights movement. We have the 8th largest black population in America. Most people don't know that. And I'd go to 8 o'clock Mass, then I'd go to Reverend Herring's church where we'd meet in order to organize and figure where we were going to go, whether we were going to desegregate the Rialto movie theater or what we were going to do. But I got my education, Reverend Doc, in the black church. Not a joke. Because when we used to get organized on Sundays to go out and desegregate movie theaters and things like that, just a kid. I got involved in desegregated movie theaters. A thing when I sat in black churches in the east side of Wilmington getting ready to, and by the way, next to two Jewish rabbis, getting ready to go out and desegregate movie theaters in Delaware.
So back and forth and back and forth and back and forth we go. Depending on what we're campaigning for, depending on who we're speaking in front of, depending on who we're trying to impress at the moment. And the story keeps changing. Most recently, he claimed that he personally convinced Strom Thurmond to support the Civil Rights Act before he died, which is ridiculous for several reasons, notably the timeline. First of all, Biden would have been 21 years old in 1964 when the Civil Rights Act was passed. He was not a senator. He would have had no occasion to cross paths with Strom Thurmond. This was a full 8 years before he became a senator at the age of 29. Thurmond, on the other hand, was a staunch opponent of the Civil Rights Act. He never supported it. In fact, he famously and vocally opposed it. Furthermore, Thurmond died in 2003, so there's no way that he could have supported an act that was passed in 1964 just before he died in 2003. That was a blatant, made-up story. Biden's pandering does not stop, by the way, in front of black audiences that he's trying to impress. He once told Jewish leaders that he remembered visiting Pittsburgh's Tree of Life synagogue. It was the site of an anti-Semitic massacre back in 2018. Except that didn't happen. He spoke by phone to the synagogue's rabbi in 2019, but he never actually went to the site. East Palestine, by the way, completely understands that because Biden, of course, can't seem to visit there. Biden repeatedly lies about his own record. He told a voter back in 2020 that he had opposed the Gulf War when it first started in 2003. That's not true. He actually vocally supported the war both before and after it started, as even CNN was forced to note. And after being called out for that lie, he tried to backtrack by claiming that he was against the war internally and simply had to figure out how to do that publicly, which would be ridiculous enough of a cover-up, but it's made even worse by the fact that after saying that, Biden again repeated the original lie as recently as December of 2022, saying again that he was against the war in Afghanistan from the beginning.
I've been against that war in Afghanistan from the very beginning. We're spending $300 million a week.
He'd already been called out for that load of bullcrap, but he was still peddling it as recently as last year. He's made a lot of strange claims, of course, that seem to be off the cuff, depending on who he's speaking to, what point he's trying to make at the time. He's claimed that oil rain gave him cancer, when in fact his campaign had repeatedly stated that the melanoma that he had had removed before taking office was largely thanks to the amount of time that he spent in the sun as a kid. But when he's talking about climate change, it becomes convenient to blame it on the oil rain in Delaware that apparently caused his cancer, not the fact that he used to, spend a whole lot of time by the water as a child. He has claimed that he grew up in a Puerto Rican community in Delaware. I guess that was when he wasn't busy attending black churches and desegregating the local movie theaters, of course. He's whatever he needs to be in front of the audience he's speaking before. Whatever he needs to be in order to score points with them. Whatever he needs to be in order to make it sound like he can relate to them on some level. Oh, I went to black churches, marched in the civil rights movement. I grew up in a Puerto Rican community. I got cancer because of oil. I used to drive trucks, lost my whole house in a fire. And oh, by the way, my family was a victim of drunk driving. He's whatever he needs to be, and he has been this for years. Of course, he's famously lied about his involvement and knowledge of his son Hunter Biden's overseas business dealings. First, he claimed that he'd never even spoken with Hunter Biden about his business dealings. Don't talk to him about it. Never even mentioned it. We've never had a conversation about it, which, of course, we know now is patently false. He met with Hunter's business associates on multiple occasions, including at the White House while he was serving as vice president, and he regularly spoke to them on the phone during his son's business meetings. Doesn't sound like a detached relationship to me. And of course, all of these lies, all of these falsehoods about his own past, they don't even include all of the times that he has lied about the economy, about his policies, about Republicans, about laws, about his own record. That's a whole other pile of lies. So you've got the anecdotes about his life. You've got him making himself out to be whatever he needs to be in front of his audience. And then you've got the outright falsehoods that he peddles about his policies and about the laws that he is opposing. That just seems to be whatever he needs it to be at the time as well. A Washington Post fact checker analysis of every speech, interview, tweet, or public statement made by Biden found that in the president's first 100 days in office, he made 78 false or misleading claims, largely about Georgia's voter laws, how many jobs his initiatives had created, facts about guns, and falsely claiming that children had starved to death in Mexico under Trump's immigration policies. Off-the-cuff remarks that were not at all founded in fact. At best, Biden appears to simply make up stories or throw out exaggerated claims to get a reaction or to appear relatable or to gin up an emotional response. He spins stories and he makes claims in an effort to appeal to common folks when in fact the truth is that he is a career politician who has spent his entire adult life mooching off taxpayers. He is not a blue-collar dude, no matter how many times he stands up in front of people and makes up stories to try to pretend to be one. And the problem is this goes far beyond a reasonable amount of grace. It is one thing to forget someone's name. It's one thing to misspeak, to call somebody the wrong title, or maybe to make an insensitive comment now and again, especially for an 80-year-old man, which is definitely a concern in the political sphere these days. We've got a president who's stumbling around, can't figure out how to get off a stage. We've got a Senate minority leader who appears to just randomly stroke out in front of microphones. We've got a senator from California who has to be reminded to go vote, and then she has to be reminded to say "I" when it's necessary. We've got a Pennsylvania senator who can barely function and can't put together a sentence and just acts almost borderline comical if it weren't so sad. These are great concerns, partly because the cognitive defects here are obvious. We have people in positions of power whose mental faculties do not appear to be up to par. And we're seeing this repeatedly, and that is of great concern, whether it's because of someone's health issues or because of someone's age. So it's not that that's not a concern here, but even beyond the age and mental capacity issues. I mean, everybody's prone to making a gaffe every now and then, getting a stat wrong, mixing up a date, but that's not what's happening here. When Joe Biden forgets who his wife is, that's a gaffe. When Joe Biden calls Kamala Harris president, that's a gaffe. When Joe Biden stands up in front of an audience and tells a detailed story about something that did not happen, that's not a gaffe. That's a lie. And this is not something that started happening when Joe Biden approached 80. This was Joe Biden at 40. This is a 5-decade-long storied history of lies, of exaggerations, of plagiarisms. I think what you have here is a politician who has spent so much time in the spotlight, who has spent so much time in politics. It's the only job this man has ever truly had. It's the only career he has ever truly had. And I think when you get your start back in the 70s and 80s, before everybody had a smartphone, before every single journalist in the room could sit there and Google the last thing you just said to see if it was actually true, what you have is a politician who was able to make his career saying basically whatever it was he needed to say at the time, and it was much more difficult to fact check, not saying it didn't happen. When he was running for president back in the 80s, he was called out for plagiarism. He was called out for exaggerations and embellishments and outright lies. But it was a lot more difficult to do in real time because Google didn't exist. Smartphones didn't exist. It was a lot harder to fact check somebody in an instant. So it was a lot easier for politicians to get away with saying whatever it was that they needed to say in the moment. And that's what Joe Biden began making a habit of doing. It's harder to get away with now because you can fact check in an instant, but that hasn't changed his habit of doing it. Standing in front of an audience, I don't even think that it's occurring to him that he's lying. I don't even think that it's occurring to him, man, I'm really telling a whopper here, or we know this didn't happen, but I'm going to say it anyway. I don't think that this is a plan. I think that he gets up in front of people that he's trying to relate to, and he says whatever he needs to say in that instant to score the points he needs to score. And if it's a falsehood, so be it. Who cares? It doesn't sound as good to say I stood there at ground zero 9 days after the attack. Sounds a little bit better to say I was there the day after. Is it a lie that needs to be told? No. But it's become so routine and so habitual to just make things up to score the points that you need. That is what we're seeing. Biden is not simply confused. His history of falsehoods long predate his apparent bout with senility here. This man is a documented and habitual liar who has been making false claims his entire political career. It's not just that he's old now and we're supposed to excuse every lie, every falsehood, every pandering load of bullcrap as just a gaffe made by an 80-year-old man who's having hard time remembering the dates. That's a cover for a decades-old issue. These are not gaffes. This is not an age problem. This is a Biden problem, and it always has been. And with that, that's the Brittany Hughes Show. Thank you guys so much for joining me. Make sure you head over to Apple Podcasts, hit the subscribe button on the Brittany Hughes Show. That way you won't ever miss a podcast episode. While you're over there, make sure you subscribe to the Newsbusters podcast with Tim Graham. That one's on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Also, sharehealthcare.com. If you're sick of paying too much money for your healthcare coverage without being sure that you know where your healthcare coverage dollars are going, and if you want to sleep with peace of mind knowing that you're getting the coverage that you need without paying for things that you disagree with, make sure you check out sharehealthcare.com. The referral code there is MRCTV23, sharehealthcare.com, MRCTV23. With that, I will see you guys back here next Thursday. Hope you have a fantastic weekend. God bless.